Today it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Elspeth Garman, a passionate scientist and expert in protein crystallography with great contributions in the field with her radiation domain studies and the introduction of Garman limit, and last but not least, a dedicated teacher. Elspeth, welcome to Oxford Cryosystems, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
You're welcome. I've been here before.
But what makes you become a scientist?
My father was an engineer in World War II, but he lost his sight just before I was born. But he taught us all to maintain our own bicycles and to experiment with things. And I actually brought along my first disastrous experiment where I learned that not all experiments actually succeed, which was this little piano made out of an old cigar box by my grandfather for my doll's house that he also made for me. And I remember watching the little cog inside going around, wondering what would happen if I fed my handkerchief into it. Well, of course, it never worked again. I did manage to find a new green sleeves action for it 35 years later, which, because it's made in Switzerland, actually fitted exactly in the same screw holes as the old ones. So that was my first unsuccessful experiment, and I was always experimenting as a child. And then I had a completely inspirational physics teacher at school. I was at a Church of England convent, and she was a nun, but she was a physicist. If she'd been a chemist, I would be a chemist. And then aged 13, she asked us one day, how long does it take the light to get from the sun to the earth? And I shouted out 8 minutes, and the entire class turned on me and said, how did you know that? And it was something I'd just always known. And that was the moment I realized I wanted to do physics. And I was so I did.
So beautiful. So, would you like to share with us also your scientific journey from CERN and nuclear physics to Oxford and protein crystallography?
So I got a summer studentship when I was a second-year undergraduate at Durham University at CERN, and I was on an experiment called G-2 magnetic moment of the muon, and they gave me 250,000 measurements of the temperature and the magnetic field of the room where they'd done the last experiment, and I analysed it and came up with the fact that there was a diurnal variation in the magnetic field because of the expansion of the back of the U-shaped magnet there, which affected the magnetic field because of the temperature difference. But that gave them an error bigger than what they'd already published, and they were not very happy with me about that. So I learnt there to stick by my guns, but I didn't want to I wanted to do nuclear physics, but not an experiment where I was either doing the vacuum systems or the electronics or the assembler code. I wanted to control the experiment, think of it myself. So I discovered that Oxford did nuclear structure physics and applied to do my PhD DPhil in Oxford. I helped with establishing that you could do carbon-14 dating using a accelerator mass spectrometer, and that was used later to date the Turin Shroud and Otzi the Iceman that fell out of the Austrian-Italian border glacier in 1991. And I built the EB crossed filter, the Wien filter, that was used as the last discrimination step for the carbon-14 to be detected, and also tested the detector. So that was great. So then after 8 years as a nuclear physics researcher and teaching physics, a tutor around Oxford in 8 different colleges, I met Louise Johnson, Professor Dame Louise Johnson at Somerville one day, and she said, what are you going to do when your contract teaching for us runs out? I said, I don't know. I didn't want to think about it. I had a 2-year-old and an 81-year-old mother-in-law living with me that I was helping to look after. I said, oh, I don't know. I'll probably have to change fields because nuclear physics isn't being funded anymore in Oxford. Meanwhile, I'd got married and my husband was building a NASA spacecraft instrument called High Resolution Dynamic Limb Sounder, which was launched by NASA in 2004. So he wanted to stay in Oxford. So she said, oh, good, we're looking for somebody just like you. Why don't you come around my lab tomorrow? We need someone to look after the X-ray generator. Who knows about vacuum systems, detectors and assembler code, which was what and workshop. We'd all done workshop courses in nuclear physics, so I could fabricate things, as we'll see in a minute. So I went round the lab and there was a major misunderstanding. The head of the lab, who was Professor Sir Lord, later Lord Phillips, David Phillips, who found the structure of lysozyme, he thought I'd come for an interview, but I thought I was looking at the job. So I had a session with him in which I said the best sentence of my life. When he said, "I hear you only want to work part-time," I said, yes, you'll have part of my time, but all of my brain. And I always pass this sentence on because it's a very useful sentence if you want to work part-time. And it's true, you think about it all the time, even if you're not actually at the job. Anyway, I rang up a few days later and said to his secretary, who was a wonderful lady called Pam Batchelor, "I'd like to apply for the job." And there was a long silence, and she said, "But oh dear." And I said, "Well, was I not considered suitable for the job?" And she said, "No, it's not that at all. It's just that we thought you'd come for an interview and you've got the job." So in fact, I never applied for it. And a few months later, I was working at molecular biophysics. Well, I didn't know what amino acid was. I didn't know what a protein was. I'd never done any biology and had a very steep learning curve. Very first day, I had an argument with one of the students because he came up from the microscope room and he said, "I've just seen a nucleus." And I'm like, "No, I've just spent 11 years looking for a nucleus and I've never seen one." And we had a big argument. And then I realized he's talking about the nucleus of a cell and I'm talking about the nucleus of an atom. And that was a very important thing because I realized we speak different languages. And if you're going to do such a crazy hop from being a card-carrying nuclear physicist to a structural biologist, you're going to have to learn a new language, learn how to communicate, because there's mathematicians, chemists, biochemists, doctors, medics, all sorts of people, and we've got to get a common language. And so communicating became very important. That's how it happened. I was the technical manager of the facility and started my relationship with Oxford Cryosystems very early on. Because I heard that there was a magic new device in the basement of the Clarendon lab called, well, I don't even think it had a name then actually, but that would provide 100 Kelvin or so at the crystal without being a pressurized dewar in the lab, which all the previous devices were a liquid nitrogen dewar, which you had a heating coil in to force the gas through. And that meant when you filled the dewar up, you got a huge change in temperature at the crystal and you couldn't really control it. So I went over and met Mike Glaser and John Cozier. And remember, I had been in physics for 11 years, so I sort of knew Mike already because I'd had to demonstrate in the labs and I'd come across him. So that's how I heard about the device. And they lifted out the cryo leg out of the liquid nitrogen dewar and they waved it around in the air like this for 30 seconds and then put it back, and the temperature at the crystal remained 100K. And I'm like, we have to have one of these. So that's how my relationship with this company started. And we were the first structural biology in the world to have one, and we have number 14.
Oh, nice. So this cryostream was groundbreaking for crystallography and for structural biology, right?
Absolutely, because of the radiation damage that occurs to a protein crystal at room temperature. And that's mainly because protein crystals, the word crystal is a bit of a misnomer. They're a bit like if you have synchronized swimmers in a swimming pool and each swimmer is a protein molecule, they don't fit together exactly. There's water in between them. But so they're lined up in an ordered array, but there's all this water. And of course, when you hit that with X-rays, you get radiolysis and you get aqueous electrons wandering around, and you get OH radicals, which then go through chemistry to produce peroxides and so on. So if you can immobilize these secondary products, then perhaps you get a longer lifetime. And in fact, that's exactly what happens. So you can't do anything about the primary absorption of the X-rays. You're going to get that. That's fact of physics. But what you can do is immobilize the products of that. And they all are immobilized at 100 Kelvin apart from one, which causes us some trouble, which is why I've spent the last 25 years looking at the effects of that one wandering artifact on moiety rather on protein crystals, and that's the electron. So they quantum mechanically tunnel, they have remaining thermal energy, and they move around the structure and cause specific structural damage to the crystal, and mean that it doesn't have an infinite lifetime at 100K either. But you get around 70 times more data at 100K than you got at room temperature. So that's a huge benefit. And that's why I think the last count, it was 89% of the protein data bank structures have been X-ray structures have been determined using a cryostat and 100 Kelvin.
You mentioned 100 Kelvin, but why and how this temperature was established?
That's a very good question, and quite honestly, at the beginning it was a fluke. So you can run these devices at 90 Kelvin. Obviously, the lowest, the liquid nitrogen is at 77, just over 77 Kelvin. But the lower you run it, the more nitrogen you use, liquid nitrogen you use to feed it. And we did notice that actually things didn't last as long if it was higher. And we did a lot of temperature ramp experiments at the beginning. But 100K at the tip of the device means that by the time that gaseous nitrogen reaches the crystal, it's at about 106, according to my thermocouple measurements. And it turns out that it's now been established at Diamond Light Source, actually, by Robin Owen, who was a case student sponsored by Oxford Cryosystems from 2002 to 2005. He's established that the OH radicals that I already mentioned, they start to become mobile at around 110 Kelvin. So what we did know was that there's a phase transition in water at 100, in pure water at 136 Kelvin. So you've obviously got to be below that. Because otherwise you get the density of the amorphous solid that you've achieved by cryocooling rather than freezing, but that's the crystal. that goes through a density change, which you don't want to happen while you're collecting X-ray data. So we were very lucky, really, to choose 100K because that's what most cryo devices are run at now for protein crystallography.
Nice. What are the other obstacles that needed to overcome back then for cryocooling?
Mainly that if you plunge a crystal into liquid nitrogen, the water in it will freeze rather than vitrify, because there's a volume change of 7% if you get crystalline ice. And the water will crystallize very, very fast. So what you have to do is add an organic aqueous solvent such as glycerol or ethylene glycol or polyethylene glycol if it's a light one, a low molecular weight one. And this sounds crazy, but what you actually want to do is dilute the water. You want to stop the water meeting a friend in the 2 seconds that you've got to cool the crystal down. Because if you take a drop of water and a crystal the size of a crystal and you plunge it into liquid nitrogen, the speed with which you have to do that, you've got to get the heat out in about 10 to the minus 5 seconds for the size of a protein crystal, say 100 micron protein crystal. And you absolutely can't do that because of the thermal conductivity and the thermal properties of that. So what you have to do is slow that process down. So it's kinetics, really, and stop the water. You want to increase the mean free path of the water molecules so they can't find a friend within that cooling period. Because if they find a friend, you'll get ice. Then they'll expand by 7%. So going back to the synchronized swimmers, imagine if you plunge them into liquid nitrogen and then all the gaps between them are going to expand by 7%, then they're going to nudge their elbows and they're not going to be ordered, they're not going to be lined up nicely anymore. So that was a major challenge to work out how to do that. And another problem is crystal dehydration. You don't want when you fish it in the little loops. So that loop technique, where you rely on the surface tension of the liquid that you've grown the crystal in order to catch it in the loop. That was due to T.Y. Teng, a researcher in Chicago who worked with Keith Moffat, and he used a metal loop to loop them up. Well, that diffracts. So what we needed was a fiber loop, and the best, I tested dental floss, shipping, fishing wire, all sorts of fibers, and the best thing was Louise Johnson's mohair jumper, which she had knitted for herself, and she gave me this ball of wool, which is a historic because sadly she passed away a few years ago, and the fibers for this made fantastic loops, and we had to tie our own loops before Hampton Research started to manufacture them. And now, of course, there's a number of suppliers who make them, Molecular Dimensions, Quantifoil, and Nitrogen. The other challenges were more technical in terms of running a multi user facility, because what you want is for the end of the cryo nozzle, so we'll take the Oxford cryostream because that's where we are, that has an 8mm, or the 500 series, which was the first one, had an 8mm diameter of coldness, and then there was a very fast ramp up to room temperature across about 2mm. So you've got a temperature profile that goes from room temperature down and then up again. So you want the crystal to be completely immersed in that stream. But lining that up was very, very difficult at first, because the cryostream had a stand which required an Allen key to adjust it. So you would undo the Allen bolt, the whole thing would move, and then you couldn't get it back to where you wanted. And then when you did it up, you'd move it because you're rotating it clockwise. So I begged John Cozier and Mike Glazer to make a stand with adjustable translations on, both upwards, downwards, that way, and that way, and that way. So 3-dimensional. So that was, they did, and made a beautiful device which saved us hours of messing around lining up. But the second thing was that it was still quite hard to get the nozzle pointing at exactly where the crystal would be. So I made a little nozzle, which this one's made of brass, and the first one I made on my husband's lathe at home had no holes in it, because we always lined up the cryostream when it was warm, and then we would line it up, put this little point where the camera, where you lined the crystal up, so instead of the crystal you'd have this little point, so you'd know it was pointing there. This was about the right distance, if you put this right on the nozzle, away from the crystal, so that you didn't want the cryostream shadowing the detector, so it had to be close enough but not too close. And then there was one dreadful day when the experimenter came and said they'd forgotten to line up the cryostream, and it was cold already, and we screwed this on, and it shrank because it was brass, and the nozzle of the cryostream is stainless steel, and it cold welded onto the end of the cryostream. We couldn't get it off, so we lined it up. We had to warm up the cryostream to get this off, and at that point I said, right, this one's not good enough, it needs holes in it, so the hole, but it was still very klutzy. So I went down to the workshop in LMB. We had a wonderful workshop technician, manned by the 2 mics, and they made me another one which was stainless steel, which we with holes in, and it was much lighter. But then I showed it to Mike and John, and the Oxford Cryosystems started to make these, and they were the first device makers, cryostat makers, that actually provided something for lining up. And this is the one that now goes out with every cryostream. So I'm very proud of that. We published it in a little Journal of Applied Crystallography paper in 1994 with my a student I was working with, a student of Louise Johnson's called Ed Mitchell, who's now the industrial manager of the ESRF in Grenoble. So I did this with him, and yeah. So
very nice. Thank you very much for this contribution as well.
Well, there were a lot of other gizmos too, but we can get onto them maybe. Yeah. This is the one that's the longest lasting, and you're still providing with the cryostream.
Yes, we do. So the crystal needs to be 7mm away from the nozzle.
Between 5 and 8mm.
5 and 8. Okay. And how did you come up with this?
I measured a lot of things with a thermocouple. So which I had on the top hats that we used to hold the crystal in the loop, and tried to make it a bit more scientific, and tell people you've only got 2 seconds to do that operation, you've got 28 seconds to do that operation, don't panic, no hurry, and so on. Because I monitored what the temperature was, for instance, the transfer tongs that we had with the top hats fitted into, that you could have this in liquid nitrogen, the crystal was in liquid nitrogen, and then you could transfer it onto the goniometer, onto the magnet on the goniometer. But the transfers were quite tricky. So the other thing that Oxford Cryosystems made many of these and sold, which we invented in Laboratory of Molecular Biophysics, was this transfer arc. So you'd take your data with your crystal in the loop on there's a little magnet, and then this is magnetic, and the crystal's in the loop at the end here. You take the data on the goniometer, and then when you wanted to save the crystal at the end, it would usually be like this. You'd screw this arc on with an Allen key, put it that way up, and then move this round like this, like that, and then you could come up with, again, Oxford Cryosystems made these and sold them. You'd come up with this full of liquid nitrogen, and you'd put it in like this, and then just move it sideways. Move this sideways. Sorry, this is fixed. Moved it sideways, and then you could put it into liquid nitrogen, save it, take it to the synchrotron if it was good, or save it. So all of these sort of ways of handling the critical thing was to keep the crystal cold the whole time. So all of this is in aid of doing that, because once it's warmed up and then recooled, it's probably not going to diffract anymore. So
definitely not. Thank you very much for showing us how the robots have evolved, right?
yes, you don't have to do this anymore at the synchrotron. But some people still use these at either these or the tongs at their home sources. So, but a lot of structural biology, protein structures. There's the thing is the crystals have got smaller and smaller and smaller. So although a lot of preparation work is done at their home sources, and also maybe inhibitor soaks and things, the really tricky problems all have to go to the synchrotron just to get enough flux density to get diffraction, strong enough diffraction to get the patterns you need to solve the structure.
Mm-hmm. But were you also involved on the standardization of the pin, of the spine pin?
That is a very, very good question. Yes, I've got a whole array of pins that are used around the world, and some of them look not at all like what the other pins look like. We did Oxford Cryosystems manufactured these nickel pin. But it was rather more expensive than the Hampton ones that came after it, and then the spine pins. And I was a bit involved with the European Molecular Biology Lab in Grenoble, but then they sent me the final designs to test and so on. But I wasn't actually at most of the meetings. But this had some really nice features. A little Allen, goniometer key. A grub screw there, which puts the pin in so that you can replace them easily with another loop. And also it had a flat along here too. There's a flat there.
Yeah, I think so.
And that meant that it was easier to pick up, see the orientation. And when you put it into the liquid nitrogen, you get the gas coming through, and there's a path for the gas to get out, which was another feature that the standardized ones don't have. So
yeah,
this was
I've
really
never seen it before.
we used to sell these in the hundreds. So yeah.
You mentioned before many organic compounds, many organic chemicals for cryoprotectant. What is your go-to cryoprotectant?
That's very interesting. It's not necessarily glycerol, because everybody has that on the shelf. So they say, oh, we'll just pour 25% glycerol in. And we published a paper again with Ed Mitchell in 1996, where we took the Hampton Screen 1 and we measured the glycerol concentration you needed to cryoprotect each one. And it varied between 0, as already cryoprotected, and 50% on a low concentration formate solution. So there's a bit of a paradox, because if you've got high salt in your crystallization buffer, you need less cryoprotectant concentration than you would if you had low salt. Now, it turns out we also, in the same paper where we published out the nozzle, actually, we measured the glycerol concentration you needed to cryoprotect phosphorylase B, which was Louise Johnson's protein that Ed was working on for his PhD. And what was interesting about that was that it went through a place where the cryoprotection was optimum, where you got the best diffraction, and then if you added too much, it started to go a worse diffraction again. So there's definitely an optimum. And Doug Dewars, who worked with Brian Matthews, did a beautiful experiment in the early 2000s where he determined what it is that's making the difference. And what you want is, when you cryocool the crystal, it contracts a bit, and you want the solvent to contract by the same amount as the protein molecule. And that's the optimum position for the cryoprotectant. I've got a very dear colleague, Jim Flugraf, who works for Rigaku, or did work for Rigaku. He's retired now, and he swears by sugars. And we teach together on many workshops how to cryocool, and he always wants them to use sugar, and I never want them to use sugar. And the reason is that the sugars are so high in viscosity that you get a sort of ball of them, and it's very hard then to get a nice thin film. Because one of my bugbears about cryocooling is to get the students to actually put the loop in the liquid in a specific way. So there's two methods. So if I've got my crystal here, I come in with the loop underneath. I call this the soup spoon method, and lift it up. I get a column of liquid. The crystal often goes down through that column of liquid, and you've got to use the crystal as a battering ram to break the surface tension forces at the top. Whereas if you can get the students to turn it by 90 degrees, go loosen the crystal, make sure it's floating around, bring it in from the side so it's here, and then pull it out of the surface perpendicular to the surface of the liquid, then you equalize the surface tension forces on both sides and you get the thinnest possible film of liquid around the crystal. Because you can wick them, but that's quite dangerous because if you're not careful, you wick the crystal as well. And so I try to get them to do this. They think I'm crazy that you can control a loop like that, but you can.
Yes, you can. I agree. I destroyed many before I managed. I hope your early experience in nuclear structure physics evolved into a focus on radiation damage in protein crystallography.
That's a very interesting question. I think I ran the X-ray facility when I changed fields. That was my job, and we wanted to build as a microspectrophotometer on the beamline at the ESRF, so that we could monitor optically what was happening when the crystals were irradiated. And this was in 1999, 2000, when we started to realize that even at cryo temperatures at 100 Kelvin, we got damage that we could see the specific structural damage. And those are experiments by Raymond Ravelli and Sean McSweeney, and also Wim Burmeister and Martin White. There were 3 papers that came out in 2000 that all reported this phenomenon, which is that disulfide bonds break at cryo temperatures, and then you get aspartates and glutamates that are decarboxylated. So I went to the ESRF with James, and we set up a block allocation group, which ran for, well, it's still running actually 25 years later, but I run it myself for 10 years, and it was groups who were interested in radiation damage from all over Europe. Peter Lindley in particular saw that it was really important to understand what was going on. So I had a long-running collaboration with Raymond Ravelli, who very sadly died of cancer 2 years ago now, nearly 2 years ago. It was really sad. He was a fantastic scientist, and I'm still working with Martin White there. And I'm still part of the radiation bag, but I haven't done experiments for a while. So I got a Royal Society grant to build this microspectrophotometer, but then the pieces of it hadn't arrived in time by the time James went to the SRF to build it. So instead, he worked with Raymond Ravelli on a program called RAD-DOSE to work out the dose that crystals were getting. This is in Fortran, which is my language. But then now, since 2013, my group have completely rewritten it and much more sophisticated, to take into account the rotation of the crystal, the fact that new volume comes into the X-ray beam as you rotate it. The first iteration of it, the Fortran version, was just, I've got a crystal and it's completely immersed in the beam and I rotate it, so it's just the time it's in there. And this is now a software that's used in many of the synchrotrons around the world, including Diamond Light Source, the Swiss Light Source, the Stanford, and NSLS2 and Brookhaven, to actually monitor, well, to actually try to estimate the dose and stop experimenters giving too much dose to the crystal that will damage the structural biology information you get out. And what we released very recently is an electron microscopy version of this for micro ED. Instead of in electrons per square angstrom, you can now get a dose in grey at which is joules per kilogram, which is the unit of dose, absorbed dose. And the reason this matters is that people are using 100 kV microscopes, 200 kV microscopes, 300 kV microscopes, and of course it matters. The incident energy of the electron is going to change the damage profile. So that's why we've done this. This work's been done by a fantastic master's student I had, undergraduate master's, called Josh Dickerson, who's just moved to Berkeley and did his PhD with Chris Russo and Richard Henderson in Cambridge, and has just gone over as a postdoc to Berkeley. And
Nice, very good. Elspeth, what will be the future direction of crystallography, which now is influenced by AI, ML, and also all these great instrumentation developments?
Well, this is a really good question, and I always call it the elephant in the room, really, because from two directions, AI and, well, of course, the AI is really behind the AlphaFold 2 models. The thing is, you still need the experimental data. So the AI models are all based on the data from the protein data bank. And without that, all those experimental structures, it wouldn't have been possible to predict the structures of another 3 million proteins. And the argument for crystallographers is that crystallography isn't dead, and you still need to actually determine these structures. But what we haven't mentioned is the huge improvement in resolution available from electron microscopy now. And for small proteins, you still need to do the crystallography, but electron microscopy has really taken off. However, a lot of places have bought electron microscopes and are not seeing the results they would like from them, simply because the sample preparation is still quite tricky, and you need people who really know what they're doing to get the best results. And I think that's an upcoming, education run that is required and will happen. We've got a paper that we're hoping to submit actually in about 2 weeks, where we've measured another 70 metalloprotein, the content of them, using the micropixie, the proton-induced X-ray emission technique I mentioned earlier. We'd already done a high throughput. I had a student who worked on making that high throughput technique of printing using a non-array jet printer. A non-contact. The company is called Radar, using a non-contact printer to spray 60 micron spots of proteins, 100 different proteins in a 10 by 10 array, 200 microns apart, which we could then scan the proton beam, steer it magnetically, and collect data overnight on these proton dried spots. And what we discovered from those initial 32 high throughput work was that a third of them had the wrong metal in their model in the protein data bank. The worry about this is that many, like 1,000 times more people use those data thinking they're correct than actually produce them. So people who know about the models know that the metal might not be right, but people who use them think, well, this is the truth. So we've just done another 70 and discovered the same proportion. About a third of them have the wrong metal in, and they all have suspicious electron density differences when you download the data and the model, showing that the model is probably not correct for the metals. So this is not only have you got radiation damaged models in the protein data bank, which is a whole nother subject, but you also got the wrong metals for the metalloproteins in many of them. So I'm still a bit active doing those experiments.
Would you mind to move on another topic? Has the role of women in crystallography changed over the years during your career?
Oh, that's a really good question. It was already extremely strong, and that is because of the Braggs. So father and son Bragg, Henry and Lawrence, they both actually had the same first name. You should never do that, to give your children the same name as you. It's very confusing. But I've got a family tree of their graduate students, and I think there was something like 30 women and 2 men. And we're talking about early 1900s here. So I mean, they just were fantastic. They were color blind to that. So we have the celebration in 2 weeks' time of the first woman being made a fellow of the Royal Society. First 2 women, and one of them was a very famous crystallographer called Kathleen Lonsdale. We have Dorothy Hodgkin, we have Rosalind Franklin, we have Eleanor Dodson, we have the most amazing Helen McGow array of British crystallographers, all because of the Braggs using, having, being open to female. We had Louise Johnson, my own boss, who inspired me, who asked me to become a protein crystallographer. So I think that the lab that Louise joined was totally different from my scenario with nuclear physics, where I was the first female graduate student in nuclear structure physics for 15 years. The group I joined didn't want me because they thought I was too weak to pull the helium dewars back to the Clarendon lab from the nuclear physics lab, and I wasn't very welcome, put it mildly. I had to fight my corner all the time, and if I made a mistake, it wasn't because I was a first-year graduate student learning, it was because women shouldn't really be there. And so I did fight my corner, and I made my way. But I nearly left in the first 2 weeks in Oxford because of the challenges of joining that lab under those circumstances. It was really tough. I joined molecular biophysics when I was 34, and it was half women. It was absolutely fantastic. And I've never, only on the most technical committees where I've looked around and realised I'm the only woman, I've thought, am I here because they had to have a woman because they have to tick a box, or am I here because they need me? This is only once that this hasn't been so on a technical panel. I was on an EU project called Radiate, where I was asked to assess beam time applications for ion beams, so like the Surrey Ion Beam Centre, and it was a European cooperative where there were about 7 different labs that would provide trans country access, so you could apply, but it had to be in a different country that you were in. We had a meeting at Karlsruhe Airport, and I walked in, and there were 7 women and 1 man, and this was the first time this had ever happened on a technical committee to me, and I was absolutely delighted, and I was completely happy about this. So I said to the 1 man who was the coordinator of it, this is fantastic that you've got all these women. I mean, this was the 7 women in Europe who know about ion beams. There probably weren't very many more. So I found it a very, very welcoming field, and I guess I was a bit older, so I wasn't nervous. And from what I told you before, which was I decided I just had to ask questions if I didn't understand, however stupid they seemed to be. I just said, I don't care, I'm going to just ask. Then, I've had a great time. And one of the wonderful things about the field has been watching the graduate students flowering and finding their feet, and just giving them a little bit of help along the way when necessary.
What would you advise to the current students that they are interested in structural biology?
Oh, wow. I would advise them to try and learn as many different techniques, complementary techniques as possible. I never did any molecular biology, but these days, instead of just solving structures, if you're a student, you really need to do all of the stages. So express your protein, purify it, and then solve the structure. And instead of doing half of one for a PhD, you need to do quite a few. I mean, it's changed completely. So I would advise them to try and learn electron microscopy as well as crystallography, because I feel they're complementary rather than competing. And also I advise them, if you're not enjoying it, find something else to do. Don't do it for the sake of it. But if you're enjoying it, then go with it. Yeah.
Nice. And where can we see Elspeth Garman next?
The big thing for me is that I've just signed off my maths textbook at last, and it's being printed, I hope, as we speak. So that's been a long project that I've got a wonderful co-author, Nicolai Lorelei from Italy, who was a graduate student in Oxford in 2008 in the pharmacology department, and he and I have written it together. So it's got some ways that they teach maths in Italy that I didn't use, but it's also mainly my course that I taught to the biochemists in Oxford. But I'm very happy to have that off.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for coming here.
Well, it's great to be back here and meet all the new people as well. It's so much bigger than it used to be. Thank you very much.